Welcome back to the WSU Democrats podcast. My name is Ethan Bishop. I'm the president of the organization. And today we're joined by a very special guest who I'm going to allow to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Lesser. I am running for election to House District 10, which happens to be the district that Weber State University is situated in. So it's great to talk with you today.
Awesome. And we're also joined by... Oh, my bad.
I'm Vaughn. I'm the vice president.
And the mics weren't working today, so that's why we have two people off screen. So if they want to say hi.
I love it.
All right. So yeah, this is going to be about a 30-minute interview type thing with Rosemary. And yeah, let's start with the first question. Your 2024 race was a nail biter. What did you learn from that race, and how are you preparing now to make up that slight difference in 2026?
I think that's a great question, and we've gone over the numbers quite a bit. What I learned the most is that it's really important to energize people who believe in our message. And like, for instance, in House District 10, 82% of registered Democrats voted, 88% of registered Republicans. Now, quite honestly, part of that issue is that in a presidential race, that really moves voter turnout because people really were anxious to vote for President Trump and also Phil Lyman. That was something that was kind of unexpected in our race. The group who was really energized to do a write-in vote for Phil Lyman. So, knowing that, we're going to really spend a lot of time with people who we need to find who embrace our message, and I think that will be really important. The thing about it is also a midterm election like this one will be very different than the presidential race in that there is no statewide office up for grabs. In 2022, when I won, Mike Lee was running. And in 24, of course, the president and Governor Cox. So this is really going to be a race about turnout. So the stuff that you guys are doing is really, really important as we engage voters from 18 to 98 and beyond.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I mean, that's the goal here, really, is we're trying to get students to be more politically engaged, even just at the tabling events when we just say, hey, let's talk about politics. We're opening a door for them to come in and really start making change. So I think that's a really great thing. So my next question, then I'll let Vaughn ask a question, is what will your first priority be when you're back in office?
Oh, I love your optimism, and I'm ready for that. One thing that I really feel strongly about is the affordability issue. That is something that people are feeling every single day. And this is something I know a lot about, is the sales tax on groceries. And all of the Weber candidates are united in their desire to remove that tax at a time that it really, really hurts people throughout the state. Now, people may say that 3% isn't that big of a deal. Well, it is if your budget is already being pinched. So I would really push for that.
Awesome. All right.
So what is your opinion on the effectiveness of the caucus system and in contrast to that, signature gathering?
Right. Well, I take a different approach to the whole caucus convention system, because when I hear them say, when I hear our political opponents say that the caucus is the closest to the person, to me that makes no sense at all, because what is the closest to the person is their actual ballot. So, when I was at caucus night last week, which was great, but, quite honestly, when people say my neighbors represent me, we have no proof that your neighbor represents you. Each of us have our own opinion, and that's why I actually favor the primary system over the caucus system. But that is not universally held in the state. So anyway, I'm
Yeah.
excited, and I'm really excited that we were able to meet the threshold of over 1,000 signatures of registered voters. And, those conversations with over 1,000 people, I think really informed my race much more than if I was just in a caucus meeting with maybe 70 people. And most caucuses never have more than that. So, you think even out of the box, we had 1,000 signatures. The caucus system, even for the Republicans, has less than 100 people. So right off the bat, you don't have representation.
Yeah, no, that's perfect because I didn't even think of the interactions you get while doing that personally. I was just thinking of the numbers. You have, less than 100 people deciding as opposed to thousands of people, when you get on the ballot. So, yeah, but when you get out there yourself and collect signatures, not only sell yourself to the voters, but yeah, that's a much better way to represent.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful to the Weber State Debs for tabling with me and getting to witness signature gathering in action. And as you remember, we had lots of conversations with people. And that's what, quite honestly, that matters even more than their signature is, in this representative government, how can you be a representative if you're not constantly engaging with people?
Yeah, that's a good point. And just to add to that, the caucus can carry a much different political energy than the voters themselves. Like you could even just look at the Republican side in 2022. I followed the Republican primary between Blake Moore and Andrew Badger, and I think Tina Cannon was running as well. But it was mainly between Badger and Moore. And Badger, I think he got like 58% of the vote at convention or at the caucus. And if he would have gone 60, I'm pretty sure that would have just made it so he was the nominee on the ballot, unless they got the required signatures. Um, but once it actually went to the ballot, like for an actual primary, Andrew Badger got smoked because he's just an extremist. But in the caucus, they were loving him. They were supporting him. Um, but yeah, that brings me to my next question. Um, what's your opinion on ICE and the warehouse that was just purchased in SLC? I know this is a hot topic.
Oh my goodness. Uh, I am just absolutely find this abhorrent. The size of that ICE facility is larger and would house more people than all prisoners in the state of Utah. The other thing is it was never built to be a housing facility, so the infrastructure for things like sewage and water and all that is absolutely terrible. The thing about it is that ICE removal of individuals with criminal history has gone on very quietly in the background without the need to warehouse individuals. And for a state that is so concerned about fiscal responsibility, this is not a fiscally responsible way to process people, especially when you look at the numbers of how many people who are being picked up don't even have a criminal history. And when you say criminal, people talk about, well, they're criminals because they're here illegally. Overstaying your visa is a civil violation. It's not a criminal violation. And treating, people the same way for a civil violation is just abhorrent to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And something that Kevin Lindell brought up was that with the huge warehouse in SLC, they weren't going to do huge internal ICE operations in Utah if they didn't have somewhere to place all of these individuals. So now that they have that, it's just like they could do another Operation Metro Surge, but in Utah. And yeah.
Well, apparently, one of the things that they envision for this is that because we have this fantastic airport, great, I love SLC Airport, that this would be like a hub. So people rounded up from all around the Western U.S. would go to this hub. But I think the conversation of this immigration enforcement is going to be a very important topic in the upcoming election.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just curious. I mean, I'm someone of the opinion more so that that we should probably roll up immigration-related criminal enforcement under the Department of Justice, or that might be the better situation, and that it was like that prior to George W. Bush. Um, there's a lot of people talking about abolishing ICE. When I hear that, all I think is just you abolish ICE as it currently stands and either place it under the Department of Justice or put radical reforms in there that shouldn't be radical, such as you can't wear masks, limits on use of force, a lot of the things that the Democrats are pushing for in their DHS funding bill. Um, but I don't know. How do you think about it? Are you more so someone who would say abolish ICE, reform ICE, put under the Department of Justice? What do you think?
I actually like your idea of the Department of Justice. And one of the things that has happened with this massive enforcement issue is that ICE, that had been previously working on trying to track down cartels and illegal financial activity, those sort of bad things that none of us want, they've been diverted to this, random pickup of 65-year-old women gardening in their front yard. So I think that the idea of the Department of Justice is a very reasonable way to do it. The other thing about it is that the funding for ICE is extraordinary. I mean, the total funding package is more than the funding for the U.S. Marine Corps. It's more than the military of Israel. I mean, we're talking massive amounts of funding, and I think that sort of power is just really dangerous to have concentrated in one organization.
Now that you bring that up, I actually want to ask a quick question. So Israel has become a boogeyman, especially among people my age, where they call out what they see as the genocide in Gaza and they say free Palestine. There was actually a report done that showed, or it was part of the leaked DNC, like what's it called? The report, the postmortem report or
Oh, yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
where they said that a huge part in Kamala Harris losing was her stance on Palestine and Israel. But I don't know. What do you think about that? And how would you quell anyone's concerns if they say they wouldn't vote for you because they just see the whole Democratic Party as just an apparatus for Israel because of how they funded Israel? I know you're not running for federal office, but still people.
Sure, sure. Well, the thing about it is, and we are witnessing this firsthand, is I think that there is a huge difference between the people of Israel and their leader, just as there is a wide disparity of opinions of Americans with our leader. I mean, when you look at the polling right now, President Trump is way underwater with what he's doing. And quite honestly, depending on the polls you see, the same is true for Bibi Netanyahu. So, I think that there is a huge difference between supporting the rights of Israel to exist on this homeland and, the recognition that there is another group of people who also need to live in this space as well. I mean, there are a fair number of Palestinians who live in Israel. So I think that it's going to be really, really hard considering how the State Department has been decimated. But I think that the only rational solution is the two-state solution that people have been talking about for a long, long time. But it needs to happen.
Yeah.
And turning Gaza into Miami Beach is just abhorrent to me. When people their lives have been disrupted, their children have suffered with lack of food and medication, and that is not how we treat our fellow human beings.
I agree with all that. So how would you say to someone who's kind of on the fence and would consider themselves a Republican, but with Trump's whole regime is kind of steering away from that, but they don't really like the Democratic Party? What would you say to kind of separate yourself from the Democratic Party in the sense of for voters who kind of look at it as the bad guys?
Right. Well, I think when it comes right down to it, people need to look at the issues. And in fact, when you look at voter registration in our state, more and more people are actually opting to be unaffiliated. And quite honestly, I have no problem with that because it means that their vote is being cast based on the issues. So, if somebody wants a good steward for our energy future and our water future, then I think that, voting for the party that has stood for environmental stewardship from the very beginning is important. For the party that has been supporting public lands here in Utah every step of the way. That's been the Democratic Party and standing up to this. But, more importantly, at the legislature, the problem is that for the most part, the Republican representatives just vote in lockstep with what their leadership tells them. If you watch any of these folks, they'll say, well, leadership didn't want that. And quite honestly, we're seeing the same thing in Washington, D.C. Mike Johnson didn't want a bill to pass. Well, how do we know that the other 221 people didn't want the bill to pass? We've got to get away from this whole, leadership says something and you fall in line. I sort of think about falling in line as being something you think about with these undemocratic regimes. You fall in line instead of think for yourself. So back to your question of what would I say to people, I would say, look at the issues and think for yourself.
Yeah, that's great. And the gridlock is just so terrible right now. Like you said, you have the Republicans on one side who just blindly follow their leaders and just want these, radical funding bills, whatever it may be. And then the Democratic Party just kind of opposes that and nothing happens. So, and then just also just getting out and talking to people they can see for themselves that, you really care about them and want to represent them. And you also mentioned energy and water. So I wanted to ask, are there any specific environmental policies that you want to push forward personally, or if not, if there's any from other candidates or people in office that you support,
Sure.
just in terms of, air quality and the Great Salt Lake and water conservation, all that?
Sure. Well, I am really passionate about this topic. And one of the things that most disappoints me about Utah and its energy future is having the legislative leadership, the ones we talked about lockstep, turning their backs on solar power. The thing about it is that compared to extractive, coal, gas, things like that, once a solar panel has been made and connected to the grid, there is no more cost associated with that infrastructure. And over, we are seeing parts of the world that are achieving like 88% renewables, primarily with solar. Even in China has essentially thrown all of the options against the wall and realized that nuclear costs 4 times what solar does. They have solar panels being made and brought the price down dramatically. We are so lucky in this state to have this amazing solar resource. And when I was in the legislature, they talked about all of the above. Well, to turn your back on one significant all of the above, which is solar, instead and having coal-powered plants like the IPP plant kept alive when it wasn't even economically viable makes no sense. So I am really, really big on the conversation about solar power in our state.
Yeah, that's huge. My brother sold solar in Oregon, where I'm from, and he did pretty well, but I can imagine it's a lot more successful here. We just get so much more sun over here.
Right. Well, what's really interesting, like for instance, when you look at, other places in the world that have done this well. So in Denmark, they're at about 88% renewables, and that's primarily wind. Now, wind is the big boogeyman also, which is a mystery to me. I mean, this is powering millions of homes all around the European Union, very inexpensively. But what I really like is that they're using their grid to balance power sources. So when it's a really windy day in Denmark, that excess power is sent to Switzerland to pump up for their hydroelectric, which is kind of like their storage, so then they can let that loose when it's not windy. And I think about various things that AI could do, and balancing power on the grid is, I think, really a great promise for AI.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because with AI, a lot of people could say that it's fundamentally bad or something like that. And I think that as far as like art goes, art should be made by humans, all that. But if we can use it to make things better and to actually help us, I think we should, especially if it's something for environmental, because something a lot of people will say is like, oh, well, it takes up so much water. And it's like, well, there's a lot of things that take up a lot more water than AI, like, for example, animal agriculture
Or how about
or,
crypto?
yeah,
Crypto
crypto.
mining.
And so there's all these things, but um, you could basically undo the negative environmental impacts of AI with doing something else, like, for example, using it to actually conserve water or using it to use this wind in the effective way.
Well, just one little thing I want to just add, and I don't know if we'll get to AI, but as far as the promises, there's certainly things to be concerned about, and we have to look at that. But like for instance, in healthcare, in my business, and having better diagnostic accuracy for people could really have a big impact on cutting healthcare costs if you get the right diagnosis the first time instead of, back for more tests, back for more tests. So I see the potential for AI really aiding healthcare providers in gathering all this information about our bodies and putting it together and proposing diagnoses that may not have come to a person's thought process. So that's one way that healthcare costs could be cut if we get things right in a more expedient way.
And just out of curiosity, are you still seeing patients?
No.
Okay, gotcha. All right. So, on the issue of democracy, what grade would you give to the current state legislature and why?
Oh my goodness. Well, um, I would probably at the end of the day give them a C. And that's because some of the worst bills were voted down. HB 279 was just a solution in search of a problem. That was the one where we were going to have poll workers sitting at a drop box to inspect your ID. And it was going to increase costs of over $1 million per county, achieving something that was really not a problem. So they get an F on 479. I also think that the changing the balance of the judiciary and our balance of power is a real threat to democracy. And so that's why I also give them a C for blasting through the court packing of their Supreme Court when the Utah Bar and even the Supreme Court Justice said, we don't need this. And yet the legislature said, yes, you do.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, and one last thing.
oh, you're good.
I thought that it was really terrible to change the rules in the middle of the equation for the repeal of Prop 4 to basically consider a postage paid envelope as a bribe when people were offered the opportunity to withdraw their signature at one of the last bills of the day or at the end of the session. With all these bills out there, we had a bill that was signed by Governor Cox at 2:00 in the morning to reject a person's ability to turn in a postage paid envelope to their clerk. Now, it's not as if you were going to be able to steam off a stamp and use it for something else. There was nothing else you could do with that postage paid envelope besides return your signature withdrawal to the county clerk. So they get an F on that one from me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's ridiculous. They were even telling us when we were had that table set up for people to remove their signatures that we were bribing people because we had little pieces of candy on the table, which we always have.
Yeah,
They were saying that that was bribing. We weren't saying, "Oh, if you remove your signature, we'll give you a candy." Like we just always had candy there.
I know.
So it was just
I
ridiculous.
know.
Yeah. Um, all right. So similar question, but on a different issue. So on the issue of healthcare, what grade would you give to the current state legislature and why?
Well, there were a few champions at the legislature who really kept some of the worst things from happening, and that was uh, for Medicaid, which is really about the only thing healthcare wise, well, not the only thing, but one of the main things that the Utah State Legislature has some control over. And what they had previously this bill that would have changed, that would have actually cut short Medicaid expansion entirely if the ratio of how much the federal government kicked in compared to the state, if that changed. And thanks to some really good work, that was kind of expanded for an extra year to sort of see what happens. So I think some of the worst things that could have happened did not happen. So I'm happy about that. But we have to stay tuned and watch what happens, especially in rural healthcare facilities in our state when they lose Medicaid coverage. And having the numbers of Medicaid recipients go down really could be the difference between a rural hospital surviving and not.
Hmm. Do you have any more questions? Okay. All right. So about the last question here. What does being a Utah Democrat mean to you? And I ask this because I think something that Dakota Worth said on the pod was that he thinks that what a Utah Democrat is hasn't been properly defined yet. So therefore, when people go and they see a Democrat on the ballot, maybe they don't fully know what to expect. Partly because there is a huge supermajority of Republicans, and we have a Republican governor and all that. Um, so yeah, what does being a Utah Democrat mean to you?
Well, it means that I belong to a party that really looks out for the well-being of the people, and that is preeminent. And the thing about it is that this is not a party that opposes economic well-being. In fact, my colleagues and I in the legislature really actively supported small business owners and things like that. But I think that this is the party that is driven by need to support the actual people of the state for their well-being. And I would actually turn that question on end, and it would be great for you to get a Republican candidate in here and define what does their party stand for. I haven't seen any elucidation of that. In fact, as you remember, in 2020, President Trump didn't even have a Republican platform. So what does their party stand for? I know what I stand for. And remember, I said before, is that people should choose their representatives based on how those values align. And if your values align with somebody who will go to the mat for you as a person, then look to the Utah Democrats.
Mm. All right. Since it is Trans Day of Visibility, my last question is, what do you say to transgender Utahns, and will you have their back in the legislature?
I will have their back in the legislature, and I believe that we shouldn't be marginalizing people for their sexual orientation any more than we should be marginalizing people for their country of origin, the color of their skin. And so this is in that same category. And I'm really sorry to see trans individuals become the victims of this boogeyman that trans individuals are, a danger to people in this state. That is just, just this. I guess one addition that I would make is that creating this whole culture of fear is really abhorrent to me. This fear that somebody is going to do something to you just by their very existence. And I, just don't regard my brothers and sisters in this area as people to be feared just because of their own private choices that, we are always proclaiming the individual strengths of the individual, and let's respect each of our individual strengths, no matter what.
Awesome response. Well, Rosemary Lesser, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And yeah, we'll see the rest of y'all later.